Hi everyone, and welcome to this presentation. My name is Katerina Brunelli. I'm a first-year master's student in environmental policy at C.CharveriatSc-Po. This video is for the course called the EU Green Deal, European Sustainability Policies in an International Perspective. And today I will be presenting on the implementation of the EU Green Deal's proposed carbon border tax and the impacts and consequences on developed countries, specifically and least developed countries or LDCs in the African continent. And to provide a quick overview, I will begin by giving some context and background to what the CBAM is. I will then talk about the impacts on developing countries, beginning with negative impacts and discussing possible ways on how to minimize those. I will then go and speak about the positive impacts and conclude. So what is the CBAM? The CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, was proposed by the European Commission in 2019 as part of the European Green Deal, a set of policy initiatives set out to help the EU reach carbon neutrality by 2050. The CBAM helps reach this goal by placing a carbon price on certain important products coming from 5 emission-intensive sectors, namely cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, and electricity, although this might be expanded to include other products in the future. How is it that the CBAM works? The CBAM equalizes the price of carbon between domestic products and imports, as exporters to the EU would have to pay a carbon price equivalent to what EU producers pay under the ETS. In other words, in the future, both exporters and domestic EU producers would all pay the same carbon tax. As you can see by the timeline presented, the CBAM is as of the end of 2022 at the trialogue stage in the legislative process and should become fully implemented at the end of 2026. So what is the purpose of the CBAM? The aim is twofold. On one hand, it aims to reduce the risk of carbon leakage, or in other words, the relocation of industries from the EU to countries with weaker climate regulations, a risk which increases as the EU increases its carbon price going forwards. This will also help EU products to remain competitive when faced with products coming in from these countries with lower regulations. On the other hand, the second aim is to incentivize climate action by encouraging countries to strengthen their mitigation efforts by decarbonizing the most emission-heavy industry sectors. There is, however, a risk of implementing the CBAM in that countries may divert high-emission products to countries with fewer regulations instead of deciding to decarbonize their sectors. So what is the impact that the CBAM would have on developing countries? Well, the CBAM could have potentially negative impacts on the developing world, especially on least developed countries or LDCs, as these countries have high exposures and vulnerability risks. Many of these, as you can see on the map, are found on the African continent, with some of the most impacted LDCs being Zambia and Mozambique for aluminium, Mauritania and Sierra Leone for iron ore, and Senegal for fertilizers. While some of the developing countries that would be impacted are Zimbabwe for iron ore, iron and steel, Egypt for aluminium and fertilizers, Algeria for cement and fertilizers, and Morocco also for fertilizers. So while LDCs are not among the EU main importers, comprising only 0.1% of EU imports in iron and steel, fertilizers, and cement, the relative importance of these exports for LDCs' economies is large, and these products are essential for their development, providing significant sources of employment and income. For example, the relative importance of Mozambique aluminium exports to the EU accounted for 7% of their GDP in 2020. Additionally, Mauritania and Sierra Leone iron ore exports accounted for 10 to 18% of Mauritania's GDP, while Sierra Leone's was between 2.5% and 50% of their GDP, depending on the price for iron. And Senegal's fertilizer exports instead accounted for between 2 and 5% of their total GDP. Currently, many developing countries have tariff and quota-free access to the EU market, which is a significant advantage the CBAM would remove. A CBAM could therefore harm the economy of these countries either by reducing their profit margins due to the higher taxes faced by exporters or through a reduction in exports. The CBAM could also potentially create an even greater barrier to trading with the EU, with countries potentially getting excluded if unable to comply with the regulations, thereby reducing their opportunities for export-led development. Additionally, the CBAM would impact not only the sector directly involved, but also industries in the supply chain. The CBAM could subsequently result in increased income inequality and worsened welfare distribution between rich and poorer countries, shifting the economic burden of the developed world climate policies to the developing world, as Boehringer said. For example, Mozambique will be hugely affected by the CBAM. While most shares of LDC imports to the EU are low, Mozambique is an exception, accounting for 7.7% of the EU's aluminum imports. Roughly 54% of Mozambique aluminium exports go to the EU. Faced with a CBAM, Mozambique GDP would drop by more than 1.6%, with some estimates saying as high as 2.5%, due to decreased demand, leading to increased unemployment, with about 2% or 250,000 jobs exposed to these CBAM impacts. So you might be wondering if there is a way to minimize these negative impacts on LDCs. Some have proposed the exemption of LDCs from the CBAM, an option which, however, is no longer viable due to the lack of support in the European Parliament. This is because it would send out the wrong signal that LDCs are not part of the decarbonization efforts, and it would hurt their competitiveness as well going forward in a market that is increasingly governed by sustainability. It would also increase the risk of carbon leakage significantly. A second option that has been discussed is the allocation of part of the revenues generated by the CBAM, which would be between 1.5 and 3.1 billion euros, to the LDCs to help transition their industries. While the revenue was initially intended for the EU budget in the Next Generation EU, giving it to LDCs would be important for two reasons. First, the earmarking of revenues for climate purposes directed towards LDCs would send out a positive message to other countries considering adopting the CBAM, incentivizing them to do the same. Secondly, this revenue could help LDCs remain competitive by helping them transition their industry sectors. Moreover, the scale-up of strong additional financial contributions beyond the CBAM revenues are necessary to help these countries transition. In fact, the African continent receives a fraction of what is required to help it decarbonize, with much of the aid presented in the form of loans and not grants. Finally, the gradual implementation of the CBAM provides LDCs with more time to modernize and decarbonize their manufacturing processes, and the EU needs to commit to continuously review the impacts of the CBAM on LDCs. There are also some positive consequences, however, of the CBAM. If the world is serious about reaching net zero by 2050, waiting to decarbonize is no longer viable, especially as African countries are some of the most affected by environmental disasters caused by the changing climate. The CBAM implementation therefore has important consequences. Firstly, the CBAM revenue could allow developing countries to invest in cleaner technologies, allowing them to reduce emissions and to remain competitive in the global market. The EU would need to provide technical assistance and technological transfer aid and innovation for low-carbon development to support decarbonization projects. The CBAM could also lead to the implementation of a carbon price by African countries, which would allow to raise revenue to support new infrastructure, avoid the CBAM, and enable more significant support to countries least able to race towards net zero. The EU should therefore provide assistance as well with designing a national carbon price if needed. Finally, the implementation of the CBAM, if accompanied by appropriate revenue and additional financial assistance, would allow LDCs in other African countries to transition, while maintaining their competitiveness in the market. Not transitioning their economy would place them at a disadvantage going forwards. The CBAM would thus allow to decrease carbon emissions coming from those countries as well, spurring a green transformation in all the African continent. To conclude, failing to redistribute part of CBAM revenue and financial support to LDCs in their efforts to decarbonize their industries could have negative consequences, especially tainting the objective of a green transition and decarbonization efforts in developing countries. If poorer countries are harmed even further, it will increasingly be more difficult to cooperate on climate action. The backlash could end up having the opposite effect and harm implementation of other such measures around the world. However, if implemented correctly, the CBAM helps broaden the path towards a greater decarbonized world, with the EU leading the way for a green transition that is at the forefront of transformation to sustainable trade. Thank you very much for listening, and you can find the references and resources for further information in the last two slides.